Bob Harwood, it is not a mistake to think of him as carefree. Tell me what it feels like to be spiritually awakened.
It was life changing. After that, it became the most important thing in life.
For many, this will be the unbelievable story of an 80-year-old who has found true identity. But then in 1984, you had a cosmic consciousness event that left you in a state of unspeakable awe.
It was totally mind boggling.
Were those words you regret using because they were so powerful, or did you mean every word of it?
No, every word. That's exactly what happened.
Do you see what I'm getting at? This sounds unbelievable.
It was unbelievable. Something was perceiving the infinite, and it was clear that everything was connected, everything was perfect just as it was, that there was this vast intelligence that was taking care of everything. Seeing the infinity of that and all the other strange things that happened during that experience, it was life changing. After that, it became the most important thing in life.
So now, life at a practical level?
Life becomes very simple and direct and down to earth and ordinary, in that you simply don't have problems, conflicts, worries, regrets. You just pretty much live in the present moment and respond to whatever's happening. Everything is just free and free flowing. It's like you fell into the river of life, no expectations, no worries, no concerns, no regrets. It's just a lot of fun.
How do I sign up for that? How does anybody sign up for that?
I'm getting to the point where I think it's much easier to explain. This is open to anybody, and it's really a matter of like breaking a bunch of psychological bad habits, let's call it.
He's a general contractor, a home builder, spiritual author, Zen activist, and for 24 years, spiritually awakened being. Bob Harwood has squeezed a whole lot of living into his 80 years, but it's the last 24 years that have brought him the loss of stress, anxiety, fear, and worry, and the addition to his life of being in the flow, as in the flow of self awareness. Welcome to Souljourns. This interview on Zoom from Coronado, California was recorded on February 25th, 2023. Hi, Bob, and welcome to Souljourns. It is a pleasure to have you join us today. Thanks for agreeing to this.
It's great to see you.
We have a lot to talk about, but I've got an idea that might be best to start this way. For those who are new to the subject that we're going to be talking about, and on Souljourns, there's probably a fair number for whom this is brand new. It might be good to start with some beginner level questions, even tough beginner level questions, which I'm going to begin with right now. Tell me what it feels like to be spiritually awakened. How's that for an easy question?
That, that's actually that's actually probably one of the more complicated questions you could ask, because it's actually pretty hard to describe. I usually use the word flow as a pointer at what it's like. In other words, life becomes very simple and direct and down to earth and ordinary, in that you simply don't have problems, conflicts, worries, regrets. You just pretty much live in the present moment and respond to whatever's happening. And you don't really have to reflect much about that at all. But uh, somebody the other day said, "You seem to be happy all the time." And before I could answer, my wife, and they said, "Why is that?" And my wife jumped in and she said, "Because he enjoys everything that he does." She had a few other comments, and they asked me again, and I said, "God only knows."
So you think of it as living in the flow of life,
Yes,
as opposed to swimming upstream.
that's right. It's very much like I read someone described it one time as being released from a tank of glue. It's like a fish getting out of a tank of glue into the ocean, where everything is just free and free flowing. It's like you fell into the river of life, which was always flowing, but you didn't realize it because you had all these ideas about everything. And and all that goes away, and you're just living life. It's just ordinary everyday life, but without conflict, no expectations, no worries, no concerns, no regrets. Uh, it's just a lot of fun.
So, third easy question: how do I sign up for that?
Actually, I think I'm getting to the point where I think it's much easier to explain how anyone can attain that.
Yeah.
It's no longer something reserved for somebody that lived in a cave for 20 years or on a mountaintop meditating endlessly and all that good stuff. This is open to anybody, and it's actually pretty simple, but you do have to be interested enough to do something about it. In
Yeah.
other words, most people have a habit pattern of living in their heads. And so the only thing that's really preventing them from realizing what's going on is a simple fact: they're in the habit of thinking all these abstract thoughts. They bought into the same, they've been conditioned by culture, by their family, by their friends to imagine that the world is composed of separate, distinct objects being looked at by an object called me. And none of that's true. And so it's really a matter of like breaking a bunch of psychological bad habits, let's call it.
Last question, especially for those who are new to this, and that is, let's compare the two. How is living in the flow, such as you say you are, different from being enlightened or self-aware?
Well, I'm not crazy about the term enlightened because it carries a lot of baggage, and
Hmm.
most people think of it as something super special, and it's really not. If people would simply become one with whatever they're doing, they would be in the flow. And people experience this all the time. They just don't realize they're going in and out of flow. Anybody who becomes extremely involved in what they're doing, whether it's art, music, their everyday work, whatever it is, when if somebody gets really involved in that activity, if they're in sports, we often say they fall into the zone, and they're being in the zone. Well, if you, let's just say that you're an artist and you're working on a piece of art, if you really get into that activity, selfhood disappears, time and space disappears. I'm a writer, and when I'm writing, time just vanishes. I'm sometimes I'm shocked that I've been writing for 4 straight hours because I'm so involved in it. And really, that's all it is. It's simply doing everything 100% and getting into the flow of life that's already there. The only reason you don't realize you're in that flow is because you're falling back into ideas that make you think you're a separate observer looking at this from the outside. Matter of fact, I think Nisargadatta was talking to a seeker one time, and the seeker said, "What's most important?" And Nisargadatta said, "Earnestness." In other
Mhm.
words, it depends upon how serious you are about really wanting to find the truth. If you're consumed by it, and virtually everyone I know, and I probably know 25 or 30 people who I would call free, who've attained this, every one of them are really consumed with finding the truth. It really mattered.
I think I'll start using Nisargadatta's word earnestness. I've always used the word intention. If you bring intention
Yep.
to something,
Yep.
it should work.
Intention, that's perfect.
Now, please share with me a little bit more because you've done so well, really clarifying for a lot of people, I think, who might be new, what this is all about. Some of the other attributes of being in the flow when it comes to daily living.
Okay. It's primarily most adults live in their heads. As they grow up, they shift from a direct interaction with reality. Little children are all in the flow. Okay. They're one with what's happening. They're in a state of oneness. As they grow older, they're conditioned to begin to have all these ideas. And as their intellect develops, the intellect actually creates a meta reality, a simulation of reality. And as we get older, we begin to interact with that meta reality rather than what's right in front of our eyes.
Mhm.
Okay, so the first big realization that I had, and this was after 20 years of thinking about these existential issues and never finding a single answer. All right. After I started meditating for a different reason entirely, it was about 10 days or 2 weeks later, I had a huge realization. And it was, my God, I've lived in my head for 20 years. I haven't seen the real world at all. In fact, literally the funniest story to most people is about 10 days after I started meditating, I began to doing a new meditative practice just because I was so curious about this one thing. And we'll talk about that. I had wondered, what do little bitty children and animals see when they look at the world? Because they don't see it in terms of ideas, images, and symbols. All right. I was a builder, so if I walked out and down a road and I saw a big oak tree, I would know that's a red oak or a white oak. That might be a valuable tree or not a valuable tree. It might have 200 board feet of lumber in it. I bet that tree is worth $300, on and on and on. Okay. And I wonder what would an animal see? The animal doesn't walk through the tree, but
Yeah.
it's not thinking like that. It's not, it doesn't have a name tree. There's no label on that thing we call a tree. So what would a little child or an animal see? A dog doesn't walk through a tree, it doesn't run into trees all the time. So I became really curious what the world looks like if you're not naming it and commenting about it and thinking about it in the same way that I'd always done. But only after about, I think I'd only walked down that road 2 or 3 times, and I came home and I told my wife, I said, Carol, there are still birds and squirrels in the world. And she said, what are you talking about? And I said, I just saw some birds and squirrels, and I unconscious, I guess I assumed hunters had killed them all because I hadn't seen them in 10 years.
Sure, sure.
I was just shocked to see there were still birds and squirrels around. And memories from childhood began to come back. The more I shifted attention away from thoughts and began to look at the world again, it was like it came alive. I began to remember all this stuff from childhood, how flowers smelled and what things looked like and felt like, and all this stuff like that. The mind was still jabbering nonstop, but at least that was a big realization. I realized, wow, 20 years of thought didn't give me a single answer. And all of a sudden, I had a big realization within 10 days.
Does this come and go, living in the flow? It's sort of like just being. But I like your phrase even better because it's a bit more descriptive. Be in the flow. Do you lose it from time to time?
No, no, you can't lose this because it's what you are. All right. You
Once
can't
you find what you are, you don't lose it.
That's right. Once you realize what the truth is, you can't fall out of this. All right. And along this path, there is an oscillation for most people between being lost in thought and having momentary experiences of oneness or being in the flow and that type of thing. And there are mountain climbers, for example, who climb mountains because when they climb mountains and they do these really dangerous athletic things, sometimes they become so focused on what they're doing that they fall into the zone and they do things they don't even know how they did it, because suddenly they become one with what's going on. And it feels so good to get out of selfhood and to get out of that feeling of separateness from reality, that they go back and climb again and again, trying to recreate that.
Did you not feel good before?
Well, sure. There were oscillations like most people. Most people have, it's like riding a roller coaster for most people. You have good days and bad days and so forth and so on. I can tell you that you find out who you are, every day is a good day.
This awakening, I don't want to ask your age because it's not a polite thing to do. I'll
No,
guess you're in your late 30s somewhere.
I'll be 80 this year.
You will be 80?
I'll be 80 this year. Yeah.
That makes me laugh because I can't believe it. But if you say it, I will believe it. Awakening first happened to you, and we'll get into the nuts and bolts of that experience later. Back in 1999, 24 years now, you've been in the flow of things. And it sounds like, I don't know if it's correct to say if you had multiple awakenings, but have the lessons continued to accumulate even though you know who you are?
Yeah, that's a good question. There's a point at which conscious seeking is over with. You found out what you wanted to know. Once you discover who you are, that's major, and that usually ends the spiritual search. It certainly ended the spiritual search for me, but it doesn't really mean that other small realizations can't continue to happen, because what we are is literally infinite in depth. And I had practiced 15 years of shifting attention away from thoughts until the mind became very silent and all these realizations sequentially occurred and so forth. The final realization was realizing that I wasn't who I thought I was, and that ended the sense of separation. In fact, the little guy in the head, and I'll talk about that more, because people have in talking to people all over the world, I've discovered that some people have what I had, a hardcore sense of selfhood. It literally feels like that you're a little person inside the head looking out at the world. All right. And on that particular day, August 17th, 99, the little guy in the head vanished. It was like, I don't, maybe it was a neural pathway of self-referentiality. All of a sudden, it shifted from what scientists call a default mode neural network associated with selfhood to what I call a unified perspective neural network, if there is such a thing. Because I suddenly realized that everything I look at is me, the real me,
Mm-hmm.
right? All there is the absolute. Call it God, call it the infinite. I like to call it this.
So with that outlook, I'm curious to know your answer to the next question. A couple of years ago, I interviewed Muji, who's a disciple of Papaji, who's a disciple of Ramana Maharshi. And I just came out of nowhere. I said, Muji, does this mean that you're no longer suffering, that you no longer have accidents, that you no longer get depressed? And he said, well, the honest answer is I do still have these little things happen, but they're not as frequent, and the intensity when they do happen isn't as intense. Is that the same with you?
I don't have them at all, but I can't even. But the little realizations. I'll give you one example. I had spent 15 years. Initially, I meditated classic Zen kind of meditation, formal sitting and so forth. Then on the side, I was doing this other little practice that I now think is way more important for people. And it's the reason I talk about it all the time. I just call it ATA minus T, and we'll talk
ATA
about
minus D. I just saw the explanation for what that stands for.
yes. Yes. In other words, this is actual. All right.
Uh-huh.
Hand is imaginary. All right. The problem is we grew up, we're taught all these distinctions, and we're taught to call this a hand and a wrist and an arm. And to show people that that's not the situation, I'll tell them sometimes, take a magic marker and show me where the hand stops and the wrist begins, or the wrist stops and the arm begins. And once they go to try to draw that exact line, they realize it's imaginary. There's no line separating any of this. It's all one. In the same way, I'll tell them, take a glass of water and tell me when, and drink a glass of water and tell me when the water becomes you. Is it just when it touches your lips? Is it when it goes down your throat? Exactly when. Once you begin to look at boundaries, you begin to realize they're all imaginary. They're like lines of latitude and longitude. Not a single separate thing exists. And that can be definitively known. But because I had practiced this other practice, which I found later became, I thought, way more important. And I think it's much easier for people to do, because a lot of people don't like to sit and meditate on a cushion. Some people do, some people don't, but a majority of people really don't like to sit on a cushion and meditate for hours or whatever. This other practice is so much easier, but it does require persistence. And I'd been in the habit of shifting attention away from thoughts to what could be seen, heard, felt, tasted, or smelled. In other words, direct sensory perception. And I'd been doing that longer. The longer I did it, the more silent the mind became, the less mind talk, the less jabbering. And as the mind became more silent, these big realizations would occur. And some of them were huge. And by 1999, I could become silent at will. The mind, and today, if I wanted to be silent, I could. It no longer matters. And one of the small realizations I had a year or so after I got free was, it's sort of like, I'll put it in Christian terms. All there is God, and God is what's even doing the thoughts. So it doesn't really matter whether the thoughts are there or not. Now, I can only think of one person I know that's awakened who likes to tell people, my mind never slowed down. Most people spent usually a fair amount of time shifting attention away from thoughts using some meditative, technique approach. But about 2 years or a year and a half afterwards, once that hit me one day, I no longer made an effort to do that. I still today if I'm driving down the road, I'm usually just looking and listening. I'm usually not thinking.
So we got to the point where you don't suffer the consequences of mistakes, let's say, maybe you once did. How about sadness? Does it enter your life?
Sure. Oh, yeah. You could be sad. I mean, I love to watch Korean dramas on the TV series.
Korean dramas.
Yeah, Korean dramas, Japanese dramas, and Chinese dramas. They're fantastic. They're just wonderful. Crash Landing on You and some of those dramas are just amazing. And they're quite different than American TV series and movies, but they're very emotional. And I love to watch them because you cry, you laugh, all kinds of emotions and so forth. It's true that almost never get angry about anything, but anger can arise. Usually, anger is it's usually a result of becoming more and more irritated over something that's happening, right?
Yeah, yeah.
But it's sort of like, it's like a little child. It's like a brief storm and it's just gone, and there's never a thought about it again.
Next question, how about fear? Does that ever enter your consciousness?
Fear is gone. And also, the fear of death instantly disappeared when the first cosmic consciousness experience occurred, because that was an unusual thing that happened. But after that, there was never any fear of death because I realized everybody's being taken care of. It's hard to explain.
Does it tell you, did you get a download as to what happens when the body dies?
Uh,
Or is that the dream melting away, revealing
well,
yourself?
well, actually, there is a realization that makes that very clear. And one of the things that I use as an example with people, this came from Alan Watts years ago. I use it a different way, and I'll say, we call this a fist. Where does the fist go when you open your hand?
Mhm.
All right, fist gone. It's here. It's gone. Somebody asked Ramana Maharshi on his deathbed, Master, are you leaving us? And he said, where could I possibly go? He's pointing to the very same thing I'm pointing to with this. All right. Where did the fist go? It's still here. All right. Because what we are is this process. We are actually the process of the opening and the closing of the hand. Right. So everything is like that. Everything is going to pass away. Everything you look at, even as Eckhart Tolle likes to say, even the sun is dying, right? It's all going to pass away. But what you are is not going to pass away. And there is a distinct, absolute realization that if the whole universe disappeared, awareness would still be here.
Well, you're talking about things that in some people's minds aren't even here to begin with. And that's what I want to ask you, because I'm pretty sure on those Thursday Zoom meetings, which we'll talk about later, where I've heard you answer and get into conversations with people, the topic would be about the illusion of life, the illusion of the world, the illusion of thoughts, the illusion of the mind itself.
This body, which is the whole thing also, it's a manifestation of the whole, it somehow apprehended itself at some extremely deep, unimaginable, indescribable level, right? And it was like after that, I knew that all this is infinite. There's no end to this. That there's no beginning, there's no end, there's just this. All right. And right now it's manifesting just like this, talking to itself. There's nothing separate. So everybody I meet, I know at a deep level, I'm always talking to the only thing that's here, which is the real self.
Well, let's go to the next question, which is a pretty simple, direct question with a few words. What is the purpose of life then? You're in the flow. Let's presume your next door neighbor isn't. What's the purpose in life that distinguishes his view from your view?
Well, usually that question is asked from the standpoint that somebody might ask me, well, what is the purpose of life? If you ask me that question right now, I would tell you that the purpose is sitting here talking to you. It's that simple. Whatever you're doing is the meaning of life and is the purpose of life. This is how life, reality, and the absolute manifest moment by moment. It's that simple.
Another simple question along the same lines is, and I've heard this from people for years and years, that you can never will yourself to awaken or to get into the flow, that you can never learn how to do this. It happens or it does not happen.
Well, that's an interesting question. It's true because I like to tell people it's impossible to make a mistake. All right. And the reason I tell them that is because they're not who they think they are. That which is doing everything is not a separate personal entity. So there's nothing that somebody who imagines himself as a separate entity can do. It's like asking, can an imaginary man climb a mountain? No, it's imaginary. All right. There's only one thing, one thingless thing here. I call it this. You could call it the absolute or the infinite or God. It does everything that's done. How do we see? How do we hear? Nobody knows. You know, you can read all the books you want to. How do you see? How do you think a thought? What's the next thought that's going to appear in your mind? Nobody knows that. Okay, it's the way this manifests and unfolds. In other words, the entire universe, in a certain sense, is a living presence that had no beginning and no ending. If there was a Big Bang, what we are was here before the Big Bang, and we'll be here after this whole universe disappears, because what we are is infinite. And it does anything that's done. If you scratch an itch, if suddenly if your head itches and you reach up and scratch it, there was no person that did that. All right. This did that. This is what does everything and thinks every thought that's thought.
Wouldn't it be easier to think of this in terms of something that's easier to relate to, such as this is all but a dream? It's a stage play being enacted out that has a
No,
beginning, a middle, and an end.
no, it's in other words, we laugh a lot of times in the Zen tradition, and we say that's the reason for a Zen stick. If somebody says this is all a dream, that's what the stick is for, to give them a good rap.
That's a big no-no, I take it.
In other words, it's just what it is. All right. And, in Zen, we have all these little test questions. Some of them you can answer them in a few hours of meditation. Others are much more difficult. I heard one Zen master say, if you ask the question, who am I really? Don't even ask that question unless you're willing to spend a few years trying to find an answer to it. All right. Because here's what's really happening. When we ask an existential question, like, where was I before I was born? Or in Zen, there's a famous question, what was my face before my mother and father were born? Or is there really a God? Any of these existential questions can't be answered with the intellect, because the intellect only deals with what's known. And what we're looking for with an existential question is something the intellect can't answer. So the intellect, and I use this example, is like a tiny little laptop computer sitting up here in our head that's creating a simulation of the world. It's great for real simple conventional stuff. If your car won't start, with the intellect, certain things, there are reasons why the car might not start. But if you ask, where is God this moment? Or how old is Jesus Christ right this moment? The intellect can't answer a question like that. But there is something that can, and that's the intelligence of the universe. And so what we are is unimaginably intelligent. All right. It does everything. It's regulating body temperature. Every cell in the body knows where to go. Every nerve impulse is doing whatever it's doing. All right. So what's happening when we ask an existential question? We are actually, the process is simple. We state what the question is. What do we want to know? All right. Whether it's who am I, or is there a God, or what's the meaning of anything we want to know. Then we mull it over, and then we shift attention away from that entirely and wait for that question to sink into the subconscious to a deeper level. It's like we're trying to access the mainframe computer that's running the whole show. We want to get out of the laptop and into the mainframe. And when I mentioned the download phenomena, that's something that happens to people a lot of times who've done a lot of meditation. They'll have one of these big oneness experiences, and there's this phenomena where suddenly it's like a current or electric current passes through the body and reorganizes all the information that you already knew, changes your patterns of thought. You learn, things that you never knew before. You've accessed, or this has accessed, this deep level of intelligence and reveal that, and it's risen to the level of the conscious mind. And that's essentially what happens when you contemplate an existential question. And Einstein summed it up, even though he was talking about scientific discoveries. He was just saying, it's a great quote. He said, I think 99 times and find nothing. I stop thinking, swim in silence, and the truth comes to me. Mm-hmm. And exactly the same thing happens when you contemplate an existential question.
Henry Ford said that, something similar. Alexander Graham Bell, all of the great thinkers learn through not thinking, is what you're saying.
That's right. Because everything that you already know is known, and you're asking questions that you don't know. And so what you're trying to do, you're trying to essentially connect to a much deeper level of intelligence that can answer any question that arises in the mind can be answered, because already the intelligence that's here knows the answer to everything.
So hence, isn't the word download a bit misleading? I think of getting into the flow or awakening, however you want to see it, as finally waking up one day to see that the fog that's been with you since the day you were born cleared its path, and you can see the truth of who you are and everything you need to know that you've already known, but just wasn't revealed to you.
Yes, the download phenomenon is just something that a lot of people have written about, and I've talked to a lot of people who've had the very same experience, and it's unusual, and I'm not saying that's anything that has to happen. Sometimes it doesn't happen at all to people. It's just something that can happen. But essentially, if you keep shifting attention away from thoughts, out of that silence, if you really have any questions you're contemplating, the answers spontaneously come out of that silence, out of this deeper level of intelligence, and they rise to the level of the conscious mind. And it happens suddenly. It's like a sudden breakthrough type of thing.
Although for some people, it's a slow, methodical revelation. I'm thinking of Tom Doss, the medical doctor from London. Maybe you've heard of him, maybe you haven't.
Yes.
I'm going to be interviewing him because he especially is appealing to me because he's been on this path forever, even though he's been busy as a doctor living in London. But it did not come with whistles and bells or fireworks or great revelations. It was just part of the process of
Yes.
following his interest, following his curiosity. Who am I really?
Yes.
And so that's a puzzle to me too, although correct me if I'm wrong, I'm beginning to see that the majority of people who are already in the flow, it did happen with a grand revelation one day.
Well, I think there's a book out right now by Angelo DeLullo, who I think is really a good teacher. He's got a book out called Awake. And he does a pretty good job explaining the whole process because, again, like I say, I've met 25, 30 people who've attained freedom, and every one of their stories are slightly different. And I'll get into this whole issue of there's a big difference between people who are, I call feelers versus thinkers. All right. Um, and there's a big difference too between how people conceive of their selfhood. Some people are like me, they had a real hardcore sense of selfhood. It felt like a little person in the head. Some people don't even know what I'm talking about. They have a much more diffuse sense of selfhood. All right, it's still there, but it's not the same. And so I have a feeling that people that have a hardcore sense of selfhood are probably people who strongly identified with their interest, and they at an early age began thinking, like I did. I thought I'm a scientist, I'm an archaeologist, an anthropologist, I'm a this, I'm a that, I'm a writer, a poet, a race car driver, I'm a mountain climber. You so strongly identify with those interests that it probably creates a more rigid kind of misidentification. You know, most people will say, oh, well, I'm a father or a mother, a Democrat, a Republican, or 1,000 other things. They identify in this way. But what you are is not identifiable. All those are just abstract thoughts. And those thoughts are keeping you away from the truth of who you are.
And what does Bob think about Christianity? Are you still there? Has it helped you? Does it contribute to the understanding if people see it through the correct prism?
Every religion seems to have a spectrum. And on one end of the spectrum are what we might call the fundamentalists. They are usually very judgmental and they're very rigid in their ideas, and everything's black and white and so forth. And there's very distinct ideas about good and bad and so forth. On the other end of the spectrum are the mystics. And this is true in Christianity, it's true in Islam, it's true in Hinduism, Buddhism, and so forth. Some religions, many of the Eastern religions, are a little more mystical in general, but they're fundamentalist Buddhists who literally believe all kinds of fundamentalist ideas about the Buddha. And
There are Catholics from my tradition who are some of the world's greatest mystics.
oh, absolutely. And in fact, Catholicism is much more open to the mystical aspect of Christianity than most Christians. All right, because you have Saint John of the Cross and Saint Teresa of Avila, and I could just name dozens, Meister Eckhart, and these people are deep. You know, they're on the far end of that mystical spectrum. So, you know, I wrote a book for Christians and I wrote a newspaper column for
I was
10
going to
years.
ask you.
There were one or two people that it really had an impact on, but in general, not too many people were interested because it was just a bridge too far. They could not accept the fact that there might be other pathways to the absolute.
Some people just don't want to hear it. some might have trouble wrapping their arms around that version of the truth that
Yes.
you probably spelled out pretty clearly in that book you wrote.
Well, and have been several deeply enlightened Christians, and there are many Christians who have found the truth without any doubt. There's a popular, I think on Bat Gap, I believe, a fellow named Hoffmeister is Christian, and he seems to be very clear. I haven't watched a video of his in a long, long time, but there are many. I mean, gee whiz, Meister Eckhart, his sermons were amazing because he would preach them on multiple levels, so that whether you were a fundamentalist or a mystic, you could interpret what he was saying level after level. And the guy was just astounding if you read some of his sermons. And
Yeah.
he would say, if you understand it this way, which would be a very traditional, conventional way, that's okay. But he said, if you want to understand it this way, and he would go a little deeper, he'd say, that's a little better, you know?
Yeah.
And he would say, and then he would just keep going deeper and deeper and deeper until it was as, it was as mystical as you could get. And if you think about it, every religion to some degree is like a box, and the truth is beyond all of that.
Yeah.
And I heard a Zen master one time. Here's a guy who's spent his whole life in Zen Buddhism. And I remember he gave a talk one time and he said, the truth lies beyond Zen. All right. And that would be like a Christian minister saying the truth lies beyond Christianity.
Yeah.
Christianity might take you there. Zen may take you there. But when you find the truth, it's beyond any imaginable conception. No abstract box can contain the truth.
Well, that takes us to our next word that I threw out at you, and that's meditation. And you're a champion in that subject. You invented your own form of meditation, which I think is just wonderful, because whether you're sitting on a Zen pillow or a seat in a busy New York subway, you can practice this meditation.
That's right. That's right. Yes, as I started off in the Zen tradition, and I started off doing this meditation, a breath awareness meditation. And, I experimented with 20 different kinds of meditation once I realized all the answers were inside and I needed to become more silent and get these, find out what I wanted to know. And I had been informally doing this little practice of trying to just look and listen, even driving around in my truck during the day. If I saw a red truck coming to me, can I look at that without thinking red truck? Can I look at that in silence? Can I just see what's right in front of me?
He calls this ATA minus T. It's Bob's favorite form of meditation. Looking at something without thinking about it. Hence, ATA minus T is attending the actual minus thought.
And it was really interesting because I think about, I don't know, I'd been going on meditation retreats. I'd gone to the Catholic Abbey of Gethsemane and done a retreat there. I'd meditated with Hindus. I'd meditated with Zen Buddhists and so forth. And after about, I don't know, 7 or 8 years of going on these solo meditation, well, not solo, but group meditation retreats, silent retreats for 3 days on the weekend, I was on a retreat and wanted to intensify I was such a spiritual athlete that I wanted to speed it up or intensify it. So every time there was a free period, I would go out and walk down the street doing this little ATA minus T thing, and it definitely intensified it. But the thing that dawned on me, which I had never realized before, was when I'm just looking, I'm doing the same thing I'm doing when I'm sitting on the cushion watching the breath.
Sure.
And once I realized that was the same, I thought, hey, I'll just do this more and more and more. Walk in the wilderness and just look at the trees, look at everything that you see, but without thinking trees, without thinking whatever it is that we normally think, without thinking about a conversation from last week or fantasizing about something next week. Just look, listen, feel, and so forth. So I began to do that more and more. And the reason I thought that was valuable, number one, it's not special. Nobody's going to get attached to ATA minus T. It's not like, I met Zen students who get very attached to formal meditation.
Sure.
Oh, you got to meditate 30 minutes a day in this particular way, and your posture has to be perfect. You have to hold your hands just right, and you have to do X, Y, and Z. None of that's necessary. If you want to do it, it's okay, no problem. But I realized with ATA minus T and doing that throughout the day, rather than just having a formal meditation practice of, let's say, 30 minutes a day, you can do ATA off and on all throughout the whole day.
Sure.
You can do it anytime, anywhere, except when you're
While
focused on.
driving, though, you better be a little careful.
No, no. You actually, there's no problem with that. In fact, when I go driving, I have no problem being totally alert, but I'm looking and listening rather than thinking all the thoughts. Now, most people have had that experience of driving down the interstate, and suddenly they sort of wake up and they realize, oh, for 20 miles, I've been thinking about these conversations with somebody that I had 3 weeks ago. And they wonder, who drove the car for 20 minutes, because I wasn't there psychologically, right? Well, I can tell you who drove the car. It wasn't who you think it was. The vast intelligence of what we are has no problem at all thinking about a conversation for 20 minutes and still driving the car in the same way that it's still moving all the red blood cells wherever they need to go in the body.
Yeah,
So this is the same type thing.
that's great.
Let's back up a minute. Let's back up a minute and talk about meditation.
Yeah.
Sitting meditation can reveal things that you can't discover through just ordinary daily ATA minus T. When you're sitting and doing meditation, you can get into deeper states. The deepest state of all we call nirvikalpa samadhi.
Yes.
It's a state in which everything disappears except pure awareness. That's all that remains.
And it's temporary. It's occasional. It's not
Yes.
all the time.
Typically, if you're on a retreat, you might go into that state for an hour or so. And there were occasions where some people have been in it for a day or two. But
Isn't that a rather good achievement, though, even though it's short-lived?
I don't even think of it as an achievement. It's just something that happens. If you
Okay.
really focus intensely, that might happen. All right. And I think the only possible advantage to that is it may have the effect of acting like a lubricant on the mind, because I've talked to several Zen people who have fallen into that deep state of mind of pure awareness for several, like on a retreat, they might fall into that state 2 or 3 times for several hours. And a lot of times afterwards, they'll have a huge cosmic consciousness kind of event. So it may have some effect that makes that more likely. And the only person I can think of that used to fall into nirvikalpa samadhi in a waking state was Ramakrishna. There are actually some photographs of him almost like a frozen statue.
Mhm.
He apparently fell into that state so easily, he even did it when he was talking to people and standing up. He just suddenly stopped and be in that deep state. That's pretty unusual. I've only met 1 or 2 people that could easily fall into that state.
Yeah.
And that does not happen with what I'm calling ATA minus T. I've never heard of it happening.
I've met one person, we were going to a dinner in the evening in Sai Baba's ashram in his honor. I think he was supposed to be feted for some reason. I forget what it was exactly. And he told me we would meet him in the grotto in the park where there's images of all the divine teachers of the world. And he was sitting with his legs crossed on a park bench. I could not awaken him. It was he was breathing at such a subtle level. He was gone, and he was gone even from my occasional pushes on the shoulder.
That's right. Yeah, and it literally feels like breathing almost comes to a stop. And there's a lot of other somatic phenomena associated with that. When you come out of that state, it almost feels like you were a block of ice that begins to melt. Right, everything seems to be in slow motion. And it's a very unusual state because you can literally feel everything unifying and coalescing prior to everything disappearing.
Mm-hmm.
It's an unusual state of mind. It is, everybody agrees, Ramanama, Maharshi, Nisarga, everybody agrees that is the deepest state of mind. But somebody asked Ramana a question one time, and Ramana said, Nirvikalpa Samadhi is the deepest state of mind, but Sahaja Samadhi is the highest state of mind. And I never knew what he was talking about till one day it dawned on me that when he was referring to Sahaja Samadhi, he was referring to the same thing I was referring to with the term flow.
Wow. And thank you for reminding me about this. And the fella who was late for his dinner party in his honor was a Catholic priest named Charles Ogata, and became a real close friend of ours. And he reminded me of something that I grew up knowing, that meditation, with the Catholic tradition of meditation, goes back to the desert priest, the monks of the 4th century.
Yes.
But the Catholics, having 1,000 things on their plate simultaneously, gave it short shrift, at least when I was growing up. Except in high school, I was taught to meditate. So
Really?
my Catholic brothers, yes. Well, we've gone through meditation pretty well. Anything else you want to say about Zen briefly? You still practice it?
No. I tell you what, after I went to a couple of retreats with Advaita Vedanta teachers, I just found those retreats more relaxed, more fun, way more expression of love and joy, and they're willing to talk about this. In the Zen tradition, this is never really talked about. It's written about to some degree, but in the Zen tradition, it's considered bad form to even talk about a lot of what we're talking about today. But in Advaita, teachers like Muji, Gangaji, and many others encourage people not to tell their personal story so much as to give an account of something that may have happened along this path. And so it is discussed, and you realize that many people have experiences of oneness. They may be short, they may be long, and so forth. And you mentioned earlier about the fellow that just gradually got clearer and clearer and clearer. Yes, there's several teachers I can think of that happened with. But in the book Awake by DeLulo, he says the same thing that I've realized is that the normal, everybody's story is slightly different, but usually there's an initial opening that he calls awakening. And then he talks about how it usually takes many years before you attain what he calls liberation. And that's sort of what we're pointing to today when we're talking about a permanent state of flow or sahaja samadhi or something like
Yeah,
that.
right. Let's move on to Ramana Maharshi's self-inquiry. Who am I? I take it listening to you, you may have a lot that you agree with and something that you don't agree with. He emphasizes quite a bit, at least for people coming into that fold, that tradition, that life is an illusion, that there is nothing real other than the dream is real, because it feels like if you can pinch your skin and feel the pain, it's got to be real. Well, dreams present that sort of a setup as well. Do you differ from that with him?
It actually depends on which quote you want to select. I have a quote by Ramana that makes it very clear that what we call physical reality is all part of the oneness. All right. So you may have to select your quote. I have read quotes where he'll talk about illusion, but it all depends upon the context. Yeah, but I do have a good quote by Ramana that really makes that clear. I
Say
wish I had it so I could read it, but I'll have to find it
can you
for you.
paraphrase it?
He basically says, once you realize the self, everything's included.
Richard Rose is the next thing. I never heard of Richard Rose until I became acquainted with some Tat friends, and then they invited me to the Tat Thursday group, which is, I'll just begin by asking you a real quick question about that. When I started with you, there were 4 of you at least who were thought to be, known to be, seen to be in the flow, self-realized or awakened, whichever term suits your fancy. And some there who didn't talk about it, who might have been included in that group, but at least the 4 of you. I couldn't believe it. Is that unusual for any group, anywhere, to have 4 people chiming in with their thoughts every Thursday?
Well, there's a lot more than that in the Zen. In the Tat group, there's probably at least 12 people I can think of who've gotten free. You've interviewed Tyler Perry.
Yeah.
Tyler's one of the clearest guys that I've met.
One of the clearest guys I've met too.
No, he's and actually we actually sort of say the same things. We sort of teach and point in the same way.
Yeah.
So we're totally on board. But there are many others. Paul Resendez. There's just bunches. Art Tickner. I could just go on and on with people.
And Nordo Okushi was the fellow who had extended the invitation for me to join this group.
Right. Norio's another. There's a whole bunch. Yeah. And some people, that's an organization that has a lot of folks that have awakened. I know that I'm familiar with the Gangaji Foundation, and I know that she's awakened dozens of people, and many of them have.
And for the benefit of anybody watching this who find it as a new thought, a Zoom on Thursday evenings, I guess East Coast time. For me, it's 4 o'clock on the West Coast in the afternoon. I don't think there's a limitation on those who can join. I don't think there's any requirements. Maybe if they want to ask me or ask you, and
Yeah,
I'll present a way for us to make that possible in this interview. The
sure. We
little
could
super,
invite anybody that we want to
yeah,
join.
I could refer them to the facilitator of the group who would invite them in.
Yeah.
So TAT serves its purpose here. I can see that quite clearly, and I'm grateful for it.
And you asked about Richard Rose. I was not one of Richard Rose's students. I didn't know about him until I encountered Tet. And I've read a lot of his stuff, and I've met so many people that he had a major influence upon. And he had some really good ideas. His idea of laddering, in other words, some people are further along on the path, and it's sort of like in mathematics. Obviously, a high school graduate in math could help somebody who's in the 8th grade with math. Somebody who's a college student with knowledge of advanced math could help somebody in high school and so forth. And he also had this concept of spiritual friendship and one helping one another on the path. And he has a lot of concepts like that that seem to be very helpful. The very fact that the TAT Foundation is functioning and has as many members as it has. The last virtual retreat, they had at least 100 people from around the world. And they've got people all over the place and people in other countries that have awakened as a result of Rose's teachings. I'm not totally familiar with all of Rose's teaching, but many of his ideas are extremely helpful because it is created like in the TAT Foundation. It's like a huge group of friends that are all interested in the same thing, and that help one another and so forth. So it's
an obvious question is why now that approaching 80, you're in the flow. Why are you still in a group like that? Why do you talk to me? Why do you present yourself to everybody?
Well, there's nothing more fun to talk about. I spent 20 years thinking about all these existential questions, and once I found the answer, I think Angelo DeLillo in his book made a good point. He said the only thing more fun than waking up from the dream of being an individual separate person and realizing that separateness is an illusion is helping somebody else wake up and watching somebody else wake. Nothing's better than that. It's great. It's so much fun.
It's over an hour now that we've been doing this, and I really enjoyed it. If it's okay with you, I'd like to end with one more comment, and it's a killer of a comment from you in your book. I think Pouring Concrete. What was the subtitle? Pouring Concrete?
Pouring Concrete, a Zen Path to the Kingdom of God.
Zen Path to the Kingdom of God, which the TAT group is going to be bringing out again with some more material in it this year.
Sure. And the only thing that we really ought to mention that's really helped a lot of people is that the reason that book was called Pouring Concrete, I'll at least mention that because the realization that occurred that day, I had been fantasizing about running off to a wilderness and getting enlightened. And
we should say you poured concrete for a living because you
owned a company. I was a general contractor and architectural designer. And that fantasy was really powerful because after the initial cosmic consciousness experience, I just wanted to get it back.
I wanted it into nature.
Yeah, that's right. And that fantasy was so powerful of running off to the wilderness. It was really sort of an escapist fantasy, but I didn't realize it until one day pouring concrete. And I took a break on this hot day from pouring the concrete. We were in the shade of the truck and I was drinking a glass of water. And that same thought occurred again. If I didn't have to be doing this stupid construction work, if I didn't have to be pouring concrete, I could be off on a mountaintop getting enlightened. All right. Yeah. On that day, a huge realization. I realized that thought is keeping me separated from the truth of what is. And that it only had to happen twice. The first, I was totally shocked. And I've told people about that. I said, if you'll ask yourself, what must you be doing this moment? Not tomorrow, not 5 minutes from now, not a year from now, this moment. What must you be doing? It becomes extremely clear. All right. And so a lot of times when I give songs or presentation or something, I'll ask the audience, I'll say, what must you be doing this moment? And there'll usually be a silence. And then someone finally will say, I guess sitting here listening to you. And I'll say, yes, you got to be sitting here listening to me, and I got to be sitting here talking to you or whatever. And if people would ask themselves that question, what must I be doing this moment? it takes away the whole idea of fantasizing. It completely eliminates that thought process.
I think you helped me and countless others to see that, not just in the book that you wrote, but your contributions, your many contributions, along with Tyler's and Paul's and Mario's on those Thursday sessions. I want to conclude on, I already called this a blockbuster. I don't, I'm a television news guy, so we tend to overstate the truth sometimes, but I don't think I've done it here. And I'm going to read the question that I wrote out for you. You pursued spiritual awakening not to lessen your own suffering, but out of curiosity, and you talked about that. But then in 1984, you had a cosmic consciousness event that left you in a state of unspeakable awe, gratitude, and humility. Unspeakable. Tell me more about that experience and how it changed you. And I want to add one other comment to it too. You say your ordinary sense of reality, your ordinary everyday sense of reality disintegrated, and that you were catapulted into a new world that was unimaginable. I mean, a feast of words that I would only hope, pray, and love to live long enough to see become true. And slowly, for a lot of us on the path, we're starting to see that. It's a self-rewarding path if you stay on it, I think, is what I'm trying to get at. Were those words you regret using because they were so powerful, or did you mean every word of it?
No, every word. That's exactly what happened.
Do you see what I'm getting at? This sounds unbelievable.
It was unbelievable. It was totally mind-boggling. And if you read Zen literature and you read, well, it's in every. I mean, it happens to Christians, it happens to Hindus, it happens to a lot of folks. Apparently, by being conditioned to perceive the world the same way other adults perceive it, as if it's populated with individual things interacting with one another in a space, time, and so forth. That consensual reality that we call the consensus paradigm becomes dominant. And parents have no choice but to teach their children the same way. And apparently this is a process as human beings that you have to go through, making all these millions of distinctions. That's a wall, a ceiling, a floor, a chair. I'm a human being, blah, 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 blah. That consensual reality, as you become an adult, is dead and flat compared to what it was like when you were very young, and compared to what it's like when you break free from that. Right? It's just like I'm saying, it's a meta reality that by comparison is dead, involves suffering eventually, because you get into self-image and you worry about what other people think and all the other nonsense that the mind generates about that. On that particular day, and usually these events are triggered by some sensory event. In my case, it's had to be a ringing telephone. Other people have had that happen by smelling some flowers or by hearing a particular sound or seeing a particular sight. Reality literally began to disintegrate. I was talking to a guy when his phone rang, and when he picked the phone up, it was like an electric shock went through. And when I looked back at him, even the features of his face were no longer stable. Everything was beginning to come apart. And when that happened, there was this tremendous upwelling of something from within. It was like emotion, but I didn't know whether I was going to burst out crying or laughing. It was that powerful that it really frightened me about what might happen next. And I made an excuse, and I ran out and got in my car. I put my hands on the steering wheel, and this thought appeared. Maybe reality is not what we think it is. And I burst out laughing. I have never laughed so hard in my life. I just had to hang on to the steering wheel for about 5, and the thought just kept repeating, maybe reality is not what we think it is. And I drove to this project, and on the way to the project, the world just became more and more alive, and selfhood disappeared. And when I got there, all of a sudden, I had this direct apprehension. I wasn't there because during that entire 15 or 20 minutes, I couldn't remember my own name. I literally tried as hard as I could and could not remember who I was. Something was perceiving the infinite. and it was clear that everything was connected, everything was perfect just as it was, that there was this vast intelligence, this unbelievable, unimaginable, whatever you want to call it, force, thingless thing that was taking care of everything. And seeing the infinity of that and all the other strange things that happened during that experience, it was life changing. After that, it became the most important thing in life.
Well, I think this is a superb way to end episode 1, chapter 1 of Bob Harwood's life. And it'll bring many people back for part 2 when we get to do that someday soon here. Bob, thank you so much. Thank you. And we'll talk to you again on Souljourns the next time around. We'll pick up from where
I
you left.
enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you.
See you, Ted.
See you. Now, don't.